They are quagmires. The Middle East, the abortion debate, Northern Ireland, climate change, all intractable conflicts, long-standing differences in belief and ideology. Joining us now to tell us why these conflicts are so particularly intractable, in New York, New York, Peter T. Coleman. He is director of the International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution at Columbia University. And Peter Coleman, as I welcome you to the broadcast, perhaps you could just start by telling us what kinds of conflicts in your work through Columbia you have studied.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me on. So we study what we call intractable conflicts, difficult long-term conflicts, or quagmires, as you suggest, at different levels. We study them in marriages and families, in community debates over polarizing issues like pro-life, pro-choice debates. And then we study them at the international level. So we've studied the civil war in Mozambique, we study Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we study Northern Ireland. So really at all levels, a similar type of phenomenon exists.
And what qualities do these conflicts have to have before they rise to the threshold of being what you would call intractable?
Well, unlike most conflicts, the vast majority of which we can resolve constructively, and even unlike more difficult, complicated conflicts that may be tough to navigate but ultimately are resolvable, intractable conflicts typically have a long history of being highly destructive, enduring, and if you look at the history of them, there's been many attempts at good faith approaches to resolving them that seem to be ineffective. So they resist intervention, they resist diplomacy or approaches at negotiation or mediation, and they really just get stuck in these long-term patterns. And that's what we consider intractable.
Now, the Middle East is one kind of intractable conflict. The abortion debate is another kind of intractable conflict. Do they have something in common, those two seemingly very disparate things?
Yeah, they can. Again, it depends on the particular nature of it. So we studied a conflict in Boston here, in the city of Boston, over pro-life, pro-choice, because it had reached in the mid-90s here a sort of fever pitch, and there was a lot of hostile rhetoric, and then there were incidents of violence. And in that case, there were very similar dynamics that we see there and that we see in Israel-Palestine and in other more violent long-term conflicts around the world. And that is essentially that they're very complicated, right? So the issue of pro-life, pro-choice, the issue of climate change, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an extremely complicated set of issues, really set of different conflicts, different players. But typically what happens over time is they become more and more kind of enmeshed. There isn't any one particular element of them, politics or hidden agendas or hate or enmity, that necessarily feeds them. It's how all these things sort of come together and really constrain people so that if you're in one of these conflicts, you really feel like it's bigger than you and you don't really have many options. And so you do what you think you should do, which is usually stay in it and probably escalate it. So very complicated conflicts that become experienced as extremely constraining of those involved. Even the leaders. Leaders very often feel like they have very few good options in these types of conflicts. And
you do see climate change through that prism, is that right?
Well, I see the debate on climate change through that issue. It's interesting because a few decades ago, environmental researchers would look at climate change, and if people were sufficiently educated in the issues and the problems, it wasn't an intractable issue. It was something that reasonable people agreed on, even though there were different proposals for solutions. But today, the issue on climate change has really fallen into the divide of sort of right and left, right, of sort of progressives and conservatives. And so it's not an issue seen in and of itself. It's not studied or approached as a purely technical or scientific issue. It's seen as a political issue. And so people tend to oversimplify it, which again is a very complex set of issues, but people think about it in very simplistic terms. And because of that, it's very hard to make political progress on the agenda.
Do you have any, I don't know if you can point to a moment in history or how this climate change debate somehow evolved from one over scientific facts to one over different ideologies. Do you have a moment where you saw that happen?
It's hard to say exactly when that happened. I think that there were sort of reasonable attempts to address issues around conservation and the environment for many years in this country and in Canada and throughout North America, throughout different parts of the world. But at some point, when it started to be used politically as a political wedge issue, it started to be used in a way that was not about addressing the problem. It was more about sort of gaining leverage from using the problem as a divide. And I would say that it probably started to happen around the signing of the Kyoto Protocol or the negotiations around that protocol, when that issue became very hotbed there. I think it probably became more polarizing in Canada, I think around the 1980s, I think, when your Prime Minister proposed more radical solutions that the public reacted strongly to. So I think at different points in history in different countries, the issue is put on the table, and when it's put on the table, it can become very polarizing when it's seen as primarily a political issue, not as a practical issue or an issue of necessity.
And do we infer now that because it's on your list of intractable conflicts that we're not going to solve this for decades and decades? Can we infer that?
Well, we can't. I mean, I think that there are some strategies available to us. I mean, I do think on the political level that there is some progress that does occur. And I think politicians, the onus is on them to grind on and try to do the best they can to make political compromises that are palatable on both sides and that will move the agenda forward there. But I think when conflicts get really stuck in that kind of dynamic, that kind of polarizing dynamic, the onus falls to others, business and the non-for-profit organizations, to sort of think creatively. And I would say there's sort of 2 or 3 strategies that can be used beyond the political strategy. One is really to, what I would say, sort of rise above that fray and have members of business, corporations, perhaps members of the government, but also members of the community and the academic community come together and identify sort of pro-business, pro-green initiatives. This is something that Denmark did in the 70s during the oil crisis there, where they really saw that crisis as an opportunity to become one of the world leaders on wind energy, on wind turbine energy. So they developed wind turbine technology, and today they produce 20% of their own energy through that. So Denmark presented an illustration of that. And today, if you look at the statistics, something like 86% of businesses see climate change and the change of temperature around the planet as both a business opportunity and as jeopardizing their business, jeopardizing their standard business practices. So they see this as a ripe opportunity. So I think it really becomes beholden on them, business leaders, and on academics and members of governments to work together with them to move beyond the discussion and the political divide of the debate and really just identify solutions that are out there that can meet both needs.
Well, here's where I come in and say yes, but there are probably other public opinion surveys which would indicate that in spite of the overwhelming evidence that climate change is a human-made thing, and it is happening, there are still plenty of people out there who will very blissfully ignore that evidence and don't want to change their behavior as a result. How does that phenomenon happen, where in spite of overwhelming evidence one way, people are still not sold?
Well, it's an interesting problem. As I said, I think at an earlier period, it really was about the lack of education and information about the problem. There was a study done in 2010 by Lawrence Hamilton, and what he found, which was sort of startling, is that the more educated that Democrats become in this country, the more they do believe in climate change. And the more educated Republicans become in this country, the less they believe in climate change. So there's a perfect interaction. And what that tells us is that the debate and opinions and attitudes around climate change are less about facts and science and getting that kind of information, and they're more about sort of emotions and values, sort of fundamentally. So I agree with you that to a large part, more information, more scientific evidence isn't necessarily the strategy to really help bridge this gap. I think one of the things that we can help people do is, again, remove it from the sort of polarized discourse and the oversimplified discourse. So some organizations in this country have a group called the National Issues Forum. And what they try to do is at the community level, they convene dialogue groups, sessions with community members where they present issues such as climate change, not just as a sort of pro-con issue. Here are the costs of regulation and here are the costs of climate change. But they really try to lay out in a much more nuanced way the variety of issues that are at stake, the consequences as well as the opportunities that are involved in climate change, and then facilitate a dialogue with members of the community that reintroduces a sense of the nuance and the complicated nature of these things. And what that does is it opens people up more to the possibility of seeing solutions, identifying solutions, and not just simply dismissing the other side's positions or the other side's ideas or recommendations. So I think that in addition to the sort of, I would say, bottom-down, or top-down business government strategies, we do need to do a better job at informing the public in a more nuanced way about the realities of these issues that doesn't oversimplify matters and doesn't vilify one side or the other.
Okay, I take your point, but do you have an example of another so-called intractable issue where you took that approach to it and it actually worked?
Well, I do. I mentioned that there had been a very polarizing and violent debate on abortion, pro-life, pro-choice in Boston in the 1990s, and then there was a shooting at a couple of clinics in 1994. And as a result of that, some leaders, pro-life leaders and pro-choice leaders, came together secretly, were facilitated by a group called the Public Conversations Project. A woman named Laura Chasen was running that project, and she brought these leaders together, and they had what they would call a secret dialogue, mostly because they were both afraid of the other side. They were afraid for their own life, as well as afraid of the repercussions from their community of them meeting with the other side. So they met secretly for a few years, and in the process of that, they had a kind of remarkable experience. On the one hand, they came to really respect, appreciate, and honor the other women as leaders, as strong advocates of women and children, and really appreciate them and appreciate their ideas. And they became more polarized on the issue of abortion. So the irony there is that as they became closer to them as human beings and stopped vilifying them and dismissing them, it became even more important to them that they convince them about their side. But what didn't happen is they didn't continue to be more destructive and violent in their tactics. So what they were able to do is sort of come together, find areas that they had common ground, help each other protect the community against new waves of violence, reduce the rhetoric in their public expressions around the issues, and really sort of change the debate. So even though their attitudes on this very difficult moral issues remained opposed, their approach to talking about it, managing it, and addressing it in the community was radically transformed. And I think something similar needs to and can happen around the climate debate. I think it really needs to be removed from the oversimplistic left, right. You know, they're all, you know, Ivy Tower scientists, liberal nerds, or they're all uninformed, you know, right-wing pro-business. I think we have to remove that kind of simplicity and help inform the public in a way that they become more open to practical solutions.
Do you know if anybody is on such a mission right now to do what you just described?
Yeah, there's a group at Yale that has been studying how these issues are framed in the public. There's a center at Yale that studies the environmental framing. There's a center here at Columbia as well that studies environmental decision-making and how these issues can be framed for the general public. We're currently conducting a study that looks at how do we start to do research with the general public to get a sense of what are the frames that don't turn, you know, half of the population on and half the population off, which further polarizes it. But are there some common issues that the vast majority of people respond to intuitively? And so we use those as ways to frame this debate around this is a shared problem that we all have. The science is good and sound, but if the science is suspect, it can't be part of the discourse. It really has to be reframed around the opportunities and the problems that climate change presents to society.
Professor Coleman, let me just ask you finally, as an educated man that you are, and as a man whose job it is to educate others, does it not sort of drive you crazy that facts in these debates often don't matter and it comes down to just what people feel in their gut is right?
Well, again, it does. It's frustrating. But I also, I study conflict. And what I understand about conflict is that when conflicts are deep and important to people, they're profoundly emotional experiences. And those emotions really influence what we attend to, what we see as important, how we evaluate other people and other things and positions. So these aren't purely rational processes. These are processes that are really drenched in emotions and values. And so I think we have to understand that. And again, as I say, for me, it's about separating the issue of climate change from all the other issues it's tied to and really approaching it as a problem that we share as a species on this earth and that we can together work for to find innovative and creative solutions. But it is around removing it from that highly emotional, highly politicized discourse and putting it back into sort of a practical necessity in the language of really problem solving at that level. So I, on the one hand, I'm frustrated that the science doesn't speak for itself. On the other hand, I understand why it doesn't, because in some ways this issue has just been integrated into other issues for political gain.
Fascinating stuff. Peter T. Coleman, it's awfully good of you to join us on the line from Columbia University in New York. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.